All right, welcome everybody to the Friends of the Cabildo member lecture series. Thank you for joining us tonight. Our next lecture is next Tuesday. It'll be actually on Louis Marie Gottschalk, and we're going to be talking about his inspiration in Latin America and South America and the Caribbean, and his influence in New Orleans as well. So I hope you join us next week as well. If this is your first time, we're doing these about every couple of weeks, and although we have a nice run of the last couple of weeks, and I know we have a couple more set up for May and June as well. Tonight's speaker is Dr. William Buckingham. He's a musicologist from the University of Chicago, but also attended Tulane University for undergraduate and master's, right? And so we're lucky to still have him here. Will's going to be talking about, you see, lost songs, the past, present, and future of Louisiana, Decima. And I know very little about this. I'm coming at the recommendations of some very good people. So I'm looking forward to hearing you talk tonight and talking more about it. So thank you so much, Will, for taking part.
Hey, all right. Thank you, Jason, for the introduction and your generous invitation here. I'd also like to thank Bill Highland, who introduced Jason and me and had the idea for me to share my work with the Friends of the Cabildo. I always have to thank my wife, Jennifer Buckingham, whose invaluable assistance with the Spanish translations and interpretations makes my work would not be possible without her help. So I just love this oil painting and sharing it. This was painted by the Isleno artist Anthony Fabra. When I interviewed him in 2016, he shared this painting of his childhood home in Delacroix. That's at center. And he recalled, when I asked him about decimas, he recalled how he grew up as a child listening to his neighbor, Cico Morales, singing decimas on his front porch next door. Sadly, this is all gone now, lost in Hurricane Betsy. The Isleño Decima, or the Louisiana Decima, is a unique tradition of folk songs in the Spanish language among a community of Spanish speakers known as the Islenos, who have lived in St. Bernard Parish since the colonial period. These songs composed an original and unique tradition. The name Decima was borrowed from a genre of Spanish poetry and song that originated in the Spanish Renaissance and endures today in a panoply of vital local traditions across the Hispanic world. In my talk today, we'll begin briefly with a discussion of this global pan-Hispanic genre called Decima, and then turn our attention to what I consider the distinct and unique local tradition of the same name, the Isleño Decima. We'll listen closely to a few of these songs, and in doing so, we'll trace a kind of history of the Isleño Decima, from precedents in medieval Spain to its local subject matter, meaning, and social significance in 20th century St. Bernard. And consider the Isleños of St. Bernard Parish as the northern tip of a Hispanic culture spanning the Gulf of Mexico. After making a point of distinguishing the Isleño Decima from its namesake as a unique, distinct local tradition, we'll close with a look at the historical traces that suggest how these two genres, in fact, have been and continue to be related. The Pan-Hispanic Decima originated as a literary poetic form in 16th century Spain and remains a vital form spanning literary and folkloric traditions, written and oral forms, pre-composed poems, and extemporaneously improvised performances. In various forms, decimas can be found throughout the Hispanic world, with notable localized traditions in Ecuador, Venezuela, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Canary Islands, for example. Its defining feature is a 10-line stanza with rhyme scheme A-B-B-A, A-C, C-D-D-C. We can think of this as a sandwich with the first and last sets of 4 lines, each with this rhyme scheme of the first and fourth line rhyming and the middle 2 lines rhyming, containing a thin, meaty couplet of 2 lines, which connect them, right? The lines are octosyllabic, so they generally have 8 syllables per line. And there are specific rules about, if you've read or studied poetry in school, for example, you can guess that there are specific rules about stressed and unstressed syllables. And these rules allow in an octosyllabic verse for as few as 7 or as many as 9 syllables in certain cases. We will be counting analyzing some syllable counts today. In addition to these 10-line based stanzas, which are the defining characteristic of this globally distributed genre, in many cases there is an introductory quatrain, a set of 4 lines, which is followed then by stanzas of 10 lines. So briefly, we'll look at an example. This comes from the Spanish poet Hector Martinez Sanz. And this was intended, I got this from his blog, this was intended as a didactic tool. So it suits our purposes well here, and not to mention it's a beautiful poem. So remember, we often find a 4-line introductory stanza, and then the 10-line stanza, which is the defining feature of this pan-Hispanic 10-line based decima, with rhyme scheme ABBA, AC, CDDC. So looking at this second stanza, you can see the first and the fourth lines rhyme, tiene and retiene. The second and the third lines rhyme, that's ABBA. And then conviene, A, that's the fifth line. And ciegos sets up the second set of 4 lines, the last set of 4 lines, which has this mirrored rhyme scheme. Octosyllabic, no se llora, si se tiene, 8, right? Now, there are no examples of songs or poems with this form being composed or sung in Southeast Louisiana. That doesn't mean that they never were, but there are no extant historical sources. And the tradition that we're going to discuss, the 20th century Isleño decima, does not employ this form, this defining feature of what are called decimas throughout the world. So let's shift gears and listen to some examples of the Isleño decima, the Louisiana decima from St. Bernard Parish. And we'll talk about, explore what's distinctive about this genre, where it comes from, and at the very end, we'll come back to this question of its namesake and look at the actual connections between the 2 genres. So this song, which I'm about to play, this was recorded by the researcher Samuel Armistead in Wyclosky, that's in Lower St. Bernard Parish, in 1975. This is the great Isleño decima singer John Robin, or also known called Johnny Robin, singing La Decima de Huila.
Cuando Huila se embarcó, eran las 7 del día. Voy para la Ribero 100 y voy a perder la vida. Si Huila no se nos muere y no nos sucede de nada, yo capo de ver su tierra de una punta a la otra arada, para plantar el maíz tierno y bichuelas tiernas. En la punta de Cocorrillo, ahí había un chalán calado con un letrero que decía, aquí murió un desgraciado. No murió de calentura, ni de punta de costado, murió de una mano de palo que tío Víctor González le ha dado. Mandan cartas y letras para aquel le llaman Víctor, mandan a decir que Huila ya es capitán de un vapor. Está muy bien. Está muy bien. Chelito Campos sabe, Elix, vamos a hablar con Elix, Chelito, ¿y quién es el otro?
I've chosen this song because it's very much representative, in my view, of the genre, the Isleño Decima as a whole, of the corpus of songs. And it illustrates what I understand to be the defining characteristics of the Isleño Decima, which also illustrate its contrasts with the Pan-Hispanic Decima. Briefly, we'll look at regarding the form. We'll come back to this more in depth later on. But just a cursory look at the form distinguishes this from the 10-line based Pan-Hispanic Decima. It shares the octosyllabic verse, so this is the same meter. And it's set in 4-line stanzas. In this example, we have a 2-line stanza hanging out in the middle, and this is indicative of this being a vernacular form. So we'll have generalities of form and then a lot of variability. There's this 2-line stanza, but it's mostly 4-line stanzas. And the rhyme scheme is generally A, B, C, B, right? We'll leave that there. And we'll come back to that, to the form later. But for now, we just observe this fundamental difference between this and the example we started with. The subject matter, plot, and narrative of this are all very characteristic of the Isleño Decima. If your experience listening to this song is anything like mine was the first time I heard it, you found it very hard to make sense out of. Opaque, impenetrable, even nonsensical. I'm always trying to think of compelling words to use to describe this essential and almost nearly unifying characteristic of the corpus of Isleño Decimas. Impenetrable, inscrutable, abstruse, and they're intentionally so. I think that's really an important aspect of the way that they were meaningful to people. We can identify 2 or 3 characters here, though. Huila, Tiacaco, and Victor Gonzalez. It's not entirely clear if the latter 2 are one and the same person, I think. It has something to do with farming or gardening and the unique difficulties of working in the marsh environment of Lower St. Bernard Parish. And there are also some familiar and nearly universal literary tropes, right? Like foreshadowing. In the 5th line, we hear, if Huila doesn't die. So you know something's up and Huila might be in trouble. But then things get really confusing in the second half of the song. We learn that someone, possibly Huila, did die. A barge sank, and there's a testament to the deceased. And then the final stanza, that people are sending cards and letters to the killer, telling him that Huila is now a boat captain. So sort of bewildering. But I think we get the feeling that it's generally ironic, possibly funny, certainly funny, possibly silly, critical, maybe invective. But there's no firm ground for interpretation. Rather, it's unsettling, like the boggy terrain, which provides the setting for this song. So the tune is in a mournful minor mode, descending melody. Musically, it sounds like a dirge, like a serious lament rather than a joke, or right? So with all this, we can surmise that there's some key information, insider knowledge needed to understand this song. And that's exactly the case. And I think a big part of what made this song meaningful and funny to the people we heard laughing. The first and crucial piece of information is that the character of Huila is a mule, that famously stubborn beast of burden. And rather than for me to carry on trying to explain further, we'll turn to we'll listen to the great Isleño singer and artist and culture bearer Irvin Perez explaining his interpretation of this song.
And they had a song that was originated down the island, really in Wood Lake. It's a song of a mule. At that time, the people used to go pick moss for a living. That was another thing that they did to try to make ends meet. And they'd go to what they call Oak River, and they would spend the summer there. Well, when they did this, picking moss, they would have to go by barges, and they would pull these barges all the way down to Oak River, which is quite a few miles away. They had to cross 2 lakes, and somebody got the bright idea, okay, we're going to take a mule. At that time, they had mules and cattle and what have you in the pastures back of the island, Wood Lake. So they decided, okay, we're going to take this mule and go put him on a barge. And naturally, a small barge and a mule don't exactly get along too good. The mule started acting up. It was an old mule. And they started beating on the poor animal to try to keep him from turning the barge over. And the thing died on him before it got to where it was going.
So somebody's bright idea, Victor Gonzalez's scheme to bring a mule to plow his field, ended badly. And the song seems to have been composed to draw attention to this mistake and shame him for his foolish behavior. Listening to La Decima de Huila and uncovering some of this meaning, we can begin to make out some of the genre's most distinctive characteristics, having to do with their subject matter and social functions. So it's elusive rather than narrative. This is really such a rich and essential part of this genre. The songs allude to something that the singer and audience are both already familiar with. They don't convey new information or a narrative that is intelligible to an outsider. Thus, the intended audience is an important feature of the tradition. It's directed at an insider audience, someone who's already familiar with the characters, places, and events in the songs. So you can imagine, in terms of social function, they serve to bring a familiar and tight-knit community closer together, right? It's invective, or at least critical, shaming Victor Gonzalez for his poor decision and the hubris that accompanied it, which suggests another social function to enforce what I've called an egalitarian ethos, to define and enforce acceptable behavior in the community. So putting a mule on a barge and beating it to death is not acceptable. And this egalitarian ethos is enforced through humor, by ridicule, and it's funny. We pointed out some other characteristics that mark it as a vernacular tradition: irregularities in stanzas and verses, which attest to its richness as a folk tradition, right? And they tend to be explicitly local, dealing with the specific demands of life in the marshes and bayous of Lower St. Bernard Parish. So on the one hand, this song is eminently local and contemporary. It's about an intimate world familiar to both the singer and his audience. If we dig a little deeper, though, this text reveals roots stretching all the way back to medieval Spain. Samuel Armistead, who recorded the version we listened to in Wyclosky in 1975, uncovered a fragment of a medieval romance, a Spanish ballad from Spain, embedded within the text of La Decima de Huila. So here on the right is a version of that romanza published in 1601, shown side by side with the transcription of the recording we just heard. And you can see I've highlighted the lines that are retentions from this ancient poem. So desdichado, we have desgraciado, and then desdichado in the romanza. I guess that's the unfortunate one. And then the next line is incredibly identical. This is 500 years of oral transmission. In the romanza, the death, this time of a human lover rather than a stubborn mule, resulted from, quote, the desperate evil of a love turned sour rather than a brutal beating. And it's not funny, of course. One of the things that seems to be funny about this song is this very serious testament to a deceased being superimposed on this absurdist story about a mule. I'll quote from Professor Armisted's analysis. What was originally part of the testament of a desperate, unrequited lover now expresses a dying mule's farewell to the world. So this song and this this specific retention encapsulates so much of this genre's character. Its ancient provenance, transformed to suit a singularly local context of wit, irony, invective, humor, and an independent egalitarian ethos uniquely suited to survival on the frontier of South Louisiana, a true reflection of the Isleño way of life in Louisiana. At this point, I think some historical context is in order. After Spain took control of the colony of Louisiana in 1762, Spain's holdings in the Americas stretched all the way from South America to Lake Pontchartrain and the Wrigley's. They undertook to strengthen this new border with with what was then British West Florida by establishing colonies of Spanish settlers along the frontier. Isleño is the Spanish word for islander, and the term is a reference to the Isleños' origin in the Canary Islands, a part of Spain which supplied settlers for Spanish colonies around the world. And so if you can imagine across the British garrisons stationed across Lake Bourne and Lake Pontchartrain, then Delacroix here southeast of New Orleans really is the frontier of New Spain. The original settlements were along Bayou Tarabouf. You can see next to Route 300. So what's marked as St. Bernard, and which I believe is locally often referred to as Toca. These were the original settlements, and Isleños gradually in the 19th and 20th century settled further down out in the lower extremities of the parish in Delacroix, Wood Lake, which is not pictured here, Reggio, Shell Beach, Wyclosky, which is across the bayou from Shell Beach. And these more distal community villages were really the most robust enclaves of Isleño language and culture through the 20th century. So I want to turn to another song. I'm going to rely on the great Irvin Perez again to help me tell this story much better than I can, this time through song. So this song was composed by Irvin Perez in 1976, almost 3 centuries exactly after the first Isleños arrived in Louisiana. At 2 centuries. Math is not my forte. At the very height of what was often described as a renaissance of Isleño culture, beginning in the 1970s, as Isleños found recourse in their unique culture to celebrate and promote awareness of their culture and history, Irvin Perez was inspired to set down the new discoveries about the colonial history of the Isleños in the form of an Isleño Decima.
We'll sing one of our own decimas, which is the one that I had composed. That was after we came from the Canary Islands. Frank Fernandez and decided that, well, maybe we ought to compose one, a hand-me-down from the time they left the Canary Islands to our day of age. It pertains to the people when they left the Canary Islands. when they got over here, how they, they settled in different sections, like in Texas and Cuba and southeast Louisiana, and how they were granted land through the Spanish government. This land was later on sold, and they went on down to the lower part of the parish, and this is where they finally settled and made a living. They also talked about the War of 1812, which is a war that our family, our generation, or their generation fought in, and that we fought in just about every war they've had. 777, varias familias dejaron las Islas Canarias para la costa de Cuba, Texas y sur de la Louisiana. En sur de la Louisiana, en tierra regalada, se pusieron de jardinero para mantener esta familia. Varios fueron de soldados, pelearon por su libertad, también salieron victoriosos ya contra Inglaterra. Viva España y su bandera, que contó mi corazón. Sé que somos americanos, pero sangre de español. Cuando el tiempo se les puso duro, cuando no podían más, se fueron de estas tierras y con otros españoles se pusieron a la pesca. Entre el pato y la rata, entre el agua y las plerías, con el ayudo de las mujeres, se buscaron la vía. Con pena y tormento y la voluntad de Dios, así nace en Pueblo La Costa de la parroquia San Bernardo. Viva España y su bandera, que contó mi corazón. Sé que somos americanos, pero sangre de español.
So this song tells the story of the Islenos of St. Bernard Parish, of their origins in the Canary Islands, migration to Lower St. Bernard, and the enduring, unique local culture they've sustained since then. It's a significant departure from the last song we listened to, La Decima de Huila. Remember how confused we felt after hearing that song? What I said was this defining insider-oriented audience. This one, on the other hand, tells a clear story. It's narrative, spelled out in clear detail for anyone to interpret, not exclusively for insiders already familiar with the people, places, and events alluded to. This song, with its very late date of composition, is very much an outlier in terms of its serious tone and narrative rather than elusive content. Thus, it attests to a living, flexible tradition which endured well into the late 20th century. As we've seen with the ancient origins attested to in La Decima de Huila, the Isleño decimas are indeed an ancient and venerable tradition connecting Isleños with the 18th century Canary Islands and medieval Spain. Meanwhile, Isleños settled in Spanish Louisiana. They were intertwined with a colonial network comprising of most of the Americas. And thereafter, they found themselves, after the colonial period, they found themselves on the northern edge of a regional Hispanic culture encompassing the Gulf of Mexico and the Northern Caribbean, Mexico, Central America, Cuba, and Florida. This is a map of the Gulf of Mexico from 1883. It's fairly recent, showing steamship lines. Nueva Orleans, as it's labeled here, is connected directly with ports in Cuba, the Caribbean, Belize, Guatemala, Mexico, Campeche, Veracruz, San Antonio, Texas. And the circumgulf region, as we might term it, was in turn connected to the Caribbean, South America, Portugal, and Spain by imperial networks and subsequently by commercial and cultural connections, which endured during the American period. And when we dig a little deeper, the underlying tendrils of history and culture which connect 777 to a broader tradition and history, and this circumgulf milieu become apparent. The first thing I'd like to draw your attention to is the form. So like La Decima de Huila, it's octosyllabic. There are 8 syllables in each verse with lots of variations and irregularities, characteristic of the genre. And all Isleño decimas share this octosyllabic verse, meter, octosyllabic meter. And it's set in rhyming quatrains, although there's one incredibly beautiful stanza with 5 lines in it in the middle here. And the rhyme scheme is generally A, B, C, B. So the second and fourth line rhyme, often with variations and approximate rhyme. So all these characteristics it shares with La Decima de Huila, as well as a narrative convention. The opening line tells the setting, just like La Decima de Huila did. It tells where and when and where the song is taking place. And these features, what do I have next? Yes, okay. Octosyllabic quatrains, 4-line stanzas in rhyme scheme A, B, C, B, and the narrative conventions of the opening are features that the Isleño decimas share with the Mexican corrido. So corridos are ballads from Mexico and the US-Mexico border regions. They tend to be narrative in a way that the elusive decimas aren't. And they're often accompanied by bands, while Isleño decimas are remembered primarily today as unaccompanied song, although often there would have been guitars or other instruments. But formally, the Isleño decimas and Mexican corridos are all but indistinguishable. And this suggests a history of exchange and influence between the two traditions. So let's listen to a corrido. This one was recorded in Mexico. I think this was actually recorded in Texas in the 1930s and tells the story of the assassination of the revolutionary president, Francisco Madero, in Mexico City in 1913.
22 de febrero, en la capital de México mataron a Madero. A las 5 de la mañana fue el primer cañonazo, esa fue la contraseña para dar el cuartelazo.
I'm sorry to cut that short. So this song, a written political corrido from later than 1913, it must have been composed in 1913 or after the events described, made its way to Louisiana and found its way into oral tradition and the Decima repertory. This version was recorded in Wyclosky in 1975. John Robin again.
313, el día 13 de enero, en la capital de México mataron a Madero. La noche estaba oscura y el aire muy sereno. Las calles principales de muertos estaba lleno. Le dicen a Madero, Te voy a dar un consejo que te recuerdes de mí. Modelo le responde con risa y mucho gusto. Me pueden fusilar y no firmo, yo renuncio. Vuela, vuela, palomita, escucha lo que te voy a decir. Vete a dile a mis amigos que se recuerden de mí.
Over the decades, the song changed in Louisiana. The date has changed. It was in February in the Mexican version. And significantly, the name of Madero, the Mexican president, is changed to Molero, presumably Manuel Molero, or a member of his family, referring to someone in that family, an important local businessman and political leader. This is a remarkable example, showing that there were strong enough connections and exchanges with Mexico in the 20th century since the events of 1913 described in the song to result in this transmission of new Mexican repertories into the Louisiana oral tradition, which were then altered and to reflect local significance. So the Mexican corrido was transformed to suit local circumstances in Louisiana. For example, in changing the name from Madero to Molero, and it also influenced the local tradition. Remember the previous song, 777? The Decima that told the story of the Islenos. Irvin Perez borrowed the tune from La Muerte de Madero for his new Decima. This is called a contrafact, when new texts are set to existing tunes, and is very common in this tradition. Listen to the first few lines again and see if you hear it.
777, varias familias dejaron las Islas Canarias para la costa de Cuba, Texas y sur de la Louisiana.
Sorry to cut that off. So far, listening to these three songs has depicted, first of all, we've uncovered the ancient origins of the tradition in medieval Spain with the Romance fragment in La Decima de Huila, brought over with the colonists, the original colonists from the Canary Islands. This is one of the pillars of the genre. At the same time, a regional Hispanic context reveals itself. Decimas, in fact, seem to be related to corridos, and there's clear evidence, as we heard listening to La Muerte de Madero, of a richly interconnected region where songs and people flowed around the Gulf of Mexico, connecting the Islenos with Mexico and a broader Gulf Caribbean regional Hispanic culture well into the 20th century. So on the one hand, I've tried here to dislodge the popular view of the Isleño Decima as an instance of a global tradition of 10-line based decimas originating in Renaissance Spain. On the other hand, though, I've pointed to even more ancient precedents for the Isleño Decima in the medieval Spanish Romance and more recent influences via the Mexican corrido. As I start to wrap up here, let's return to this question of the connection between the Isleño Decima and its namesake. They do, after all, share a name, the pan-Hispanic 10-line based genre that we began with. This was recorded in 1893, I think. I might be off by a year, by the great historian and folklorist ethnographer Alce Fortier, who recorded this from an Isleño named Pepe Martin on a field trip to Delacroix. It begs us to imagine an older tradition of 10-line based decimas in St. Bernard. I've superimposed the line breaks. Fortier just had the lines without stanzas broken up like this. But when you look at it like this, a very clear decima form reveals itself, very similar to the one we started out with. You have a 4-line introduction, which actually rhymes perfectly, almost perfectly, A, B, B, A. Not perfectly. There's a loose rhyme scheme there. And then if we think of the next 10 lines as a 10-line stanza, remember the rhyme scheme, A, B, B, A, A, C, C, D, D, C. Excuse me. Hey, kiddo. Yeah, in a minute, okay? C, D, D, C. That rhyme scheme actually largely works here. So hermosura and defensa tuya, that's line 6 and 7. That should be B, B in a decima. And the first and the 5th and 8th lines is an approximate rhyme, hasanya and bataya. And then it gets really good because I'd say it gets really good. It reveals this trace of a decima, of a 10-line decima, where haya, line 9, that should be A again, and then palma, which is an approximate rhyme with baya. And then lines 12 and 13, which should rhyme in a decima stanza, rhyme here. So this begs us to imagine, this recording from 1893 begs us to imagine an older tradition of 10-line based decimas, probably giving the modern, the 20th century genre its name, in St. Bernard Parish, in which the formal parameters gradually loosened and gave way to the corrido-influenced form of the 20th century Isleño decima. Jean Gillespie has identified another trace of a 10-line stanza in the Louisiana repertory in this example. This is a popular Isleño decima going back at least to the 1940s. And once again, I've made the line breaks. So this is my analysis. Obviously, this is an oral tradition, so it wasn't written down until scholars transcribed it. So, but once again, you can see it's a little bit looser, but we actually have a typical corrido or Isleño decima quatrain to begin with, where the 2nd and 4th lines rhyme. But then I'm not going to try to walk us through it again, but remember, look at the 2nd stanza, those 10 lines, and the decima is A, B, B, A, A, C, C, D, D, C, and there are some traces of that rhyme scheme here. Of course, yeah, I'll leave it there. Yeah. So the song is about Boy Molero, an important local figure in the Molero family. And I read it as a tall tale, an exaggeration about the size of his boat, right? This is like an important figure. So I read it, this is my interpretation, as sort of poking fun at him. His larger than life boat, and someone who needs, 20 or 30 people to go shrimp fishing. Yeah, okay, and we're going to listen to another great singer, Chelito Campo, a great Isleño decima singer and folk artist and culture bearer. This is from, yeah, I'll play it here. Oh, he doesn't sing exactly these lines, so, but it's such a beautiful recording and it's a beautiful video. So here you go.
Boy Molero vino a la isla. El hombre habla con su razón, que anda buscando gente para pescar el camarón. En la isla contra 20, en Bencheque 21, solamente que en el tono no pude encontrar ninguno. Voy a mandar a hacer una barca con una buena largura, que cuando la proba aquí, que la popa en Chepitula. Cuando el boy encendió las luces y en el centro del mar se quedó todo alumbrado como la calle Canal. Cuando voy saliendo.
So I wonder if anyone is recognizes the tune. I think it's based on the Mexican pop. This is, oh, yeah, okay. This is from the 1984 Mosquitoes in High Water. That was a television documentary on WYES, and you can Google it and find it streaming, or email me if you don't see it. I can send it to you. I think the tune is based on the Mexican popular song Cielito Lindo. We'll listen to a minute of it, and you can agree with me or disagree with me. Here it is.
De la sierra morena, cielito lindo, vienen bajando un par de ojitos negros, cielito lindo de contrabando. De la sierra morena, cielito lindo, vienen bajando un par de ojitos negros, cielito lindo de contrabando. Ay, 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 canta y no llores, porque cantando se alegran, cielito lindo, los corazones.
Okay, I'll leave that there. I just have a few closing comments, and we'll still have some time for a discussion. The Isleño Decima and its namesake, the Pan-Hispanic 10-line based Decima, remains a cornerstone of Isleños' sense of their identity and history today. Since the 1970s, Isleños have embarked on a project of reclaiming their heritage and forging renewed connections with the Canary Islanders and their descendants all over the world. This in the face of the relentless erosion of the old Isleño villages like Delacroix and Wyclosky that once sustained the Isleños language, culture, and way of life, and the passing of the last generation of culture bearers who knew these songs and the unique Spanish dialect which they sustained. Isleños have recovered the 10-line based decimas they've heard on visits to the Canary Islands and embraced them as part of their heritage, alongside the local songs which we've been exploring here. So even as we come to grips with the Isleño Decima no longer being a vital tradition in St. Bernard Parish, there are no living practitioners who can sing the old songs and compose new ones, and not who do it publicly, who I'm aware of. Even so, the tradition continues in many ways as it always has. It's burgeoned and strengthened by these new connections with the 10-line based decimas that the Canary Islanders and their descendants continue to perform. It continues as a malleable, flexible tradition that Isleños use to define themselves and their communities. We might then think of the Isleño Decima's relationship to its namesake as a pendulum. In the 1890s, when our historical record of the Isleño Decima begins, with Alce Fortier's transcription, the pendulum had already begun to swing away from the 10-line stanza, as shown by the trace of the 10-line stanza in Fortier's transcription of Decima de Amor. Today, as Isleños reconnect with their roots in the Canary Islands and their fellow Canary Islands descendants around the world, they reclaim the 10-line genre as their heritage, and the pendulum swings back. Thank you.
Fantastic presentation, Will. We have a couple people still left on there, so we have time for some questions. I will actually, if you don't mind, I would like to start off the questions. There's a lot here to ask here. But my first question is as someone of Sicilian descent, is there anything that would relate to what the Canary Islanders did to something the other people that came to America, or anywhere in the world and done something like that, or is it just come from this part of the world?
Yeah, it's a great question. On the one hand, I've always really been struck by what I see as a very distinctive local culture. What makes Isleños of St. Bernard Parish so remarkable? And what I know about Sicilians in New Orleans, for example, is I think of them as yeah, more yeah, more a part of urban life, more what's the word? Anyway, but whereas the Islenos are sort of identified with these enclaves, and like, right, people, of course the Sicilians came in the 19th century. What I would say though is I think that the ethnic revivals that happened in the 1970s is something that the two groups share, and I think yeah, Italian Americans in a lot of ways sort of set the mold for groups like the Islenos to yeah, to turn their ethnic heritage from something that was derided, right, going back into something to celebrate. I don't know if that speaks to your question, but
no, but it definitely does, because I mean, it just the way they sound is very similar to when I was growing up. My grandparents and stuff sitting around, they would sing and stuff like that. So it sounds like that somewhat.
Yeah.
So I wanted to see if there was a possibility that this was normal for other people to do part of this. Does it, Barbara or Arlene? Do you have questions? Because I have more. Or Andrew might have questions as well. Well, the other thing I wanted to ask you about was when we were listening to the song about Madeira, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think in some ways that it almost feels like that they're telling a story to tell a story? That they're actually trying to teach people a story almost as much than just a story they just wrote and it became a song? Or is it them actually expressing a story that they want other people to hear so that other people can remember it?
Yeah, it's a great question. My understanding of the corridos is that yeah, like sort of celebrating famous deeds or a great leader or something like a major event, not necessarily celebrating, but dramatizing it, like we find in this song. In this case, it's tragedy, right? Is I think a really big part of that genre, which it doesn't share with Isleño decimas. Decimas, as far as I can tell, don't do that. Isleño decimas. So it's really interesting that this song made it into the oral tradition. And I wonder, being as the name had changed, and that I think anyone singing or hearing that song would know that Molero wasn't in Mexico City and wasn't shot.
Right.
I wonder how it sort of meant to people who were singing it and listening to it, say in mid-century St. Bernard. So my question I would want to suggest that maybe the same words could have a very different meaning when they're performed in a different context like this. And maybe it was more, yeah, I'm not sure any of us will ever really be able to penetrate the meaning of that song as it was performed in St. Bernard Parish. But you've pointed out a really important nuance and what I see as a distinction between corridos and Isleño decimas.
I mean, it's definitely an important, I mean, the way they tell the stories in there, I mean, the tradition of telling these stories and probably, sitting around listening to people talk about, sing these songs is probably such an important tradition for the Isleños that, they were, it was just the fact that we got to hear and see video of the guy singing in 1984 is unbelievable. Because it really was fantastic. So I thank you so much. If anybody else has a question, we have time for extra questions. If not, I want to thank Will for presenting tonight on a topic that I knew very little about, and now I know a little bit more. And so I appreciate your willingness to come on and talk about it. And thank you so much. And we hope to see everybody next Tuesday for talking about Gottschalk, who's got a little bit of connection to New Orleans as well, and might have worked his way somewhere, might have picked something up for tonight's lecture to go in for next week. So thank you so much, Will. We appreciate it. And thank everybody. Have a good night. And thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.